Hi everyone, Timothy Ferris here with a few words about the making of predictions. What I'm going to suggest today is that the best way to ascertain whether a statement is true or false is by turning it into a statement that has some predictive value. A statement that can be tested, even if only by waiting to see whether its predictions come true. That's how science works. Science is rational, to be sure, but rational thinking can lead you to many false conclusions. What makes science work is experiment. You don't just say something that sounds persuasive, but you state it in a way that it can be tested by experiment. The theorist who comes up with the idea may be able to design the experiment him or herself, or some other scientist may be able to do so, but it's the experiment that will determine in the long run whether the statement is true or false. And that can be applied in other areas of human life as well, beyond science. The late Murray Gell-Mann, Nobel laureate physicist, used to tell a story about how when he was a young man, he was at one of his first scientific talks. And as Murray told the story, there were all these famous theoretical physicists discussing how it could be in the context of quantum mechanics that the spin of an isotope called boron-10 was a 1. A quantum spin is a number that describes something that isn't really spin, but it looks a little bit like spin on the classical level, so it's one of the basic quantum numbers. And in Murray's telling, this was much discussed among the theorists until it came to the Q&A period, and then an experimenter, Murray describes him as a grubby little man who worked in the basement of the building, stood up and said, the spin of boron ain't 1, it's 3. The theorist said, how do you know? And he said, because I just measured it. Murray told that story to illustrate that ultimately in science what matters is the verdict of experiment, which is to say that you make a prediction and the experiment either verifies your prediction or invalidates it. If it invalidates it, maybe another version of the theory will work, or maybe your theory is wrong altogether. But it's experimentation, the verdict of nature herself, that counts. Experimentation is also the basis of the liberal democracies in the United States and the other nations that have enjoyed now centuries under the world's most popular and most successful form of government. Liberal democracy was modeled on science. The founders of the United States of America talked considerably about the United States itself, its new form of government, the liberal democracy, as being an experiment which might fail, but which each year that it survived, messy as it was, seemed all the more to have survived the verdict of experiment. Thomas Jefferson was a famous scientific experimenter, as was Benjamin Franklin, but even George Washington, a military man, and Thomas Paine, an author, conducted scientific experiments. They understood what they were doing, that the validity of their claims that liberal democracy would work depended on the verdict of actually trying to do it, seeing how the experiment turned out. Prior to the rise of science, the main way in which the validity of statements was evaluated was by appeal to an authority. Typically, one asked a priest who either answered the question based on scriptures or some other kind of religious authority, or kicked the question up to some higher level priest who did the same thing. And that's why the world's earliest scientific societies, first one established in Italy centuries ago and called itself the Society of Experiment, or the Royal Society in England, whose motto is, take nothing on anyone's authority. The idea was we look to experiment, not to the authoritarian system of the past. So I've been saying that the best way to determine whether a statement is accurate is to see if it makes a specific prediction. It can then be tested either through experimentation or by consulting current facts or by just letting things play out and seeing what happens. A little over a century ago, a great many people thought, and therefore predicted, that the best form of government would turn out to be a truly socialist government, even a communist government, in which the government itself, the state, would take money from those who had more money and give it to those who had less, and that this would produce a better society than the liberal democracies. That experiment was tried, unfortunately, on 1 billion people, and the results were a hideous failure. Most lethal disaster in all of human history. So it was possible there to make a prediction and to test it, and the test proved it to be wrong. That said, we can ask, what kind of people make the best predictions? Steven Pinker, in his estimable book, Enlightenment Now, reports on a study conducted by the psychologist Philip Tedlock, who, over the course of 20 years, examined some 28,000 persons to determine what kind of individual makes the most accurate predictions. The results were interesting. What Tedlock found was that true believers in ideology or religion, the sort of folks who have the old approach that questions are to be answered through an appeal to an authority, the sort of public intellectual who says, only by accepting this can you investigate that, the sort of politician who says, I invented this problem and only I can solve it, that those folks are the worst at making predictions. What kind of people are best at making accurate predictions, of actually peering a bit into the haze of the future? Those who are modest tend to couch their statements in qualifications. The sort of people who are willing to admit when they're wrong. You know, the young Galileo in Padua and before that in Pisa was known for answering some questions by saying, I don't know. It was so uncommon back then. The common thing was to always show off your knowledge by saying, well, St. Augustine said this, or the Bible says that. Galileo really stuck out over that. In other words, the sort of person that has, in classical terms, a liberal frame of mind, a willingness to listen to other people's views, to listen to discordant facts, and try to find what is the truth in this welter of contending opinions and sometimes discordant facts. The person who put that particularly well was Judge Learned Hand, back about 70 years ago now, who said, the spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it's right. Hey, thanks for listening. See you next time.